I was 12 when I saw my dad poison my mom. Not in a movie, not in a dream. In our own kitchen with the lights dimmed and snow falling outside the window. He thought I was asleep, but I watched him pour something into her wine glass. Then he looked at me and smiled. My name's Hailey, and for 30 years I kept that secret. Where are you listening from tonight? Drop your city in the comments, and if you believe some truths are too dangerous to stay hidden, subscribe. There's more to come. Back then, we lived in a yellow farmhouse tucked deep in northern New Hampshire. You couldn't see another house from our kitchen window, just miles of pine trees and snowbanks that swallowed fences every winter. It looked like the kind of place you'd raise a family in safe, quiet, predictable. My dad, Brent, was an engineer who worked from home. He always smelled faintly of cedar and motor oil. Every weekend, he'd fix something: a squeaky hinge, a broken latch, a loose banister before anyone even noticed. People loved him. He mowed the neighbors' yards when they were out of town, showed up early to town hall meetings, never raised his voice, never missed Sunday service. My mom, Marla, was a nurse at the county hospital. She wore soft blue scrubs and kept her hair pinned in the same bun since the 90s. She made everyone feel taken care of even when she was bone-tired from a double shift. I was an only child. Quiet, observant. I spent most afternoons at the kitchen table doing homework, listening to the sound of their voices drifting through the house. To the outside world, we were exactly what people envied. No slammed doors, no police calls, no rumors whispered at the grocery store. Just a 3-person postcard, living in a yellow house with a red mailbox. But looking back, I think I always knew something was off. It started small. My dad began locking the shed, even though he never used to. He got irritated when I asked simple questions. And he started watching my mom in this quiet, measured way, like he was calculating something. One morning, I walked into the kitchen and found him standing completely still, staring at a bottle of vitamins on the counter. He didn't hear me at first. When he did, he snapped out of it and smiled, too quickly. At dinner that night, he reached across the table and added salt to my mom's soup before she could take her first bite. She laughed, said, "That's new," and kept eating. But I watched him watch her, like he was waiting for something. Later that week, I saw him at the computer. I only caught a glimpse, but the browser showed search terms like dosage by body weight, untraceable substances, and symptoms of arsenic. He closed the laptop when I entered the room and asked if I wanted hot cocoa. I said no. That night, he walked past my bedroom, then stopped. I held my breath and watched his shadow under the door. He didn't move for a full minute, then he walked away. I remember thinking maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe dads did weird things sometimes. But deep down, I wasn't sure. People say kids don't notice things, but we do. We just don't know what they mean until it's too late. It started with the headaches. At first, Mom just rubbed her temples and brushed it off. Stress, she said. Long shifts at the hospital. But then she started forgetting things, small things, like where she parked the car, or if she'd already taken her medication that morning. One night, I found her standing in the laundry room holding a wet towel, just staring at the dryer like she didn't recognize it. She smiled when she saw me, but it didn't reach her eyes. I told Dad. He nodded, said he'd keep an eye on her, then handed me a glass of milk and told me not to worry. But I did, because the milk tasted funny, not spoiled, just off, like something had been added then masked with vanilla extract. I didn't drink it. I poured it down the sink and ran the water until the smell was gone. A few days later, I noticed he'd rearranged the medicine cabinet. Mom's vitamins were in new bottles labeled by hand. No pharmacy name, no dosage details, just black marker, take 1 daily. She didn't question it. Why would she? Dad was the careful one, the provider, the man who built our house from the foundation up. But one afternoon, while taking out the trash, I saw something tucked at the bottom of the bin. A small brown bottle, no label, just a white sticker with a strange code C27X. I pulled it out with a plastic bag over my hand, then hid it under my bed. That night I tried to look it up on Mom's computer, but nothing came up. Just results about paint thinner. Lab samples, things I didn't understand at 12 years old. I didn't tell anyone. I just kept watching, kept listening, and I started writing everything down in a spiral notebook I kept behind my bookshelf. Every date, every symptom, every strange moment, people call it a journal, but for me it was the only kind of armor I had. Because something was happening, and deep down I knew it wasn't just in my head. It was in hers. It happened on a Tuesday. I remember because it was spaghetti night. We always had spaghetti on Tuesdays. Always. Mom had just come home from a double shift. She kissed my forehead, said she was going to shower, and asked Dad to keep the pasta warm. I was setting the table when I heard the thud. Not loud, more like a collapse, a soft, heavy drop onto tile. I ran to the hallway and found her halfway in the bathroom, still holding a towel. Her eyes were closed, her mouth slightly open. I screamed. Dad didn't. He walked over, knelt down beside her, checked her pulse, then calmly called 911. He told the dispatcher she probably fainted, said she had low blood sugar, sounded like he'd practiced the story already. The ambulance came fast, lights flashing against the snow. They took her in. I sat in the back seat of Dad's truck, watching the wipers move in slow arcs. He didn't say a word the whole drive. At the hospital, they ran tests. Monitors beeped. I waited in a plastic chair while Dad talked to the nurse in low tones. He never looked shaken, not once. That night, while he was on the phone in the hallway, I slipped into his home office. The password hadn't changed. Still our dog's name, Daisy 23. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I found it anyway. An email starred and unread from a company I didn't recognize. Subject line: policy confirmed. Effective Jan 1. It had an attachment, a scanned insurance document. Policyholder Marla Monroe. Primary beneficiary Brent Monroe. Secondary redacted. It was dated 3 weeks ago, signed electronically, approved without medical check. I printed it, folded it twice, slipped it into my backpack between a book and a drawing of a snowman I'd done for school. He never noticed it was gone. I didn't understand everything yet, but one line at the bottom stuck with me. Payout in the event of non-natural death, $250,000. That number burned into the back of my mind. The next morning, Mom was home again, pale, tired, but smiling like nothing had happened. Dad made her tea, sat by her side. And I sat in silence, watching him stir the sugar just a little too long. After that night, I stopped waiting for someone to believe me. Instead, I started collecting proof. Every morning, I wrote down what Mom ate, how she felt, what pills she took, and who gave them to her. I had charts, drawings, even taped receipts I pulled from the trash. I didn't know what I was building, but I knew I'd need it someday. Then one afternoon I got out of school early. Dad was late picking me up, which almost never happened. So I waited and watched. When his truck finally pulled into the parking lot, I ducked behind the tall shrubs near the library wall. Instead of parking, he pulled into a side lane and turned off the engine. I saw him check his watch, then glance around. 10 minutes passed. A second car arrived. An older man stepped out, gray coat, sunglasses, the kind of face that disappears in a crowd. Dad got out too. No words, just a nod. They exchanged something. It wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no briefcases. Just a simple white envelope passed from hand to hand like they were trading letters. Then both got back in their cars, drove away like nothing happened. I followed, not closely, just enough to see where he went. He stopped at the grocery store, bought eggs, bread, milk, came home and kissed Mom on the forehead. I stood in the doorway, backpack still on, trying to decide if I should say something. I didn't. That night when he left his coat draped over the armchair, I searched the pockets. The envelope was gone, but the receipt wasn't. Dated that day, from a storage rental facility across town, Unit 11B. I circled the address in my notebook and drew a question mark next to it. Then I added a word I hadn't dared to write before. Motive. Because now it didn't just feel like something might happen, it felt like it already had. I was only 12, but I knew what secrets look like. They never shout, they whisper. It took me 3 weeks to find the courage to go there. Storage Unit 11B, on the edge of town, behind a line of broken vending machines and a chain-link fence with barbed wire. I waited until Saturday when Dad said he had a hardware run to make. He left right after breakfast. Same truck, same plaid coat, same calm smile. 15 minutes later, I took my bike and rode like my life depended on it. The facility looked half abandoned. Graffiti on the back wall, snow piled high along the edge of the pavement. I found Unit 11B. The padlock was missing, just a thin sliding bolt. I hesitated, then pulled. It groaned open. Inside a folding chair, a cardboard box, a steel safe no bigger than a microwave, and the smell of dust, cold metal, and something chemical I couldn't name. I didn't touch the safe, but I opened the box. Old receipts, a burner phone, and pill bottles, some full, some empty, all stripped of labels. But it was the photo that stopped me cold. An 8x10, print the kind you frame and keep on the mantle. It was us, Mom, Dad, and me standing in front of the house last fall. Only now, Mom's face had been cut out. Clean, precise, gone. Not burned, not scribbled out, just removed. I stared at that picture until my hands went numb from the cold. And then I put everything back exactly where I found it. Locked the unit, rode home, hung my wet gloves over the radiator like nothing had happened. Dad returned an hour later with a bag of mulch and a new wrench. He kissed the top of my head, asked if I'd been working on my science project. I nodded, said I was building something, and I was. Not a volcano, not a robot, but a case. A quiet, careful, undeniable case. Because whatever was coming, it wasn't going to stop on its own, and neither was I. It happened on a Thursday. The snow had finally stopped, but the wind still howled around the corners of the house, scraping tree branches across the windows like fingernails. Mom had been sick all day, feverish, pale, dizzy enough to crawl instead of walk. Dad made her soup, said it was his special recipe, sat with her on the couch stroking her hair while she sipped from a chipped blue mug. I sat across the room pretending to read. The notebook rested in my lap, pen tucked beneath my sleeve. I logged every movement, every word, even the way he stirred the soup 3 times clockwise, once counter. Around 10 p.m. he helped her upstairs, tucked her in, dimmed the lights, kissed her on the cheek, then came back down and poured himself a drink. I stayed still, listened as he lit the fireplace, clicked through channels without watching, then turned everything off again. By midnight, he was in the kitchen. I heard him talking, but not on the phone, not to Mom. I crept down the stairs, each step like thunder in my ears. Stayed in the dark just outside the doorway. He stood by the sink, hands resting on the counter. His glass sat untouched. The bottle was half full. He was looking at his reflection in the dark window pane. And talking, quietly, carefully, almost kindly. "She won't feel a thing," he whispered. "She's so tired now, it'll just stop, and we'll be free." I pressed my recorder. The red light blinked just once. She always needed too much, too loud, too much light, too many feelings. He laughed soft, hollow. She never knew when to let go, but I do, I always do. Then silence. He stood like that for what felt like forever. And then he reached into the cabinet above the fridge, the one we never used. Pulled down a small white box. He opened it, took out a dropper bottle, held it up to the moonlight and smiled. That was when I moved. Slow, precise, every breath measured. I crept back upstairs, closed my door. I didn't sleep, I didn't cry, I just waited. At sunrise, I made tea for Mom, plain, no sugar. She sipped slowly, held my hand. Her fingers were cold. I told her I loved her. She said she loved me more. Then she closed her eyes and drifted back into sleep. I went to school like it was any other day, but instead of going to class, I walked 2 blocks past the library into a small brick building with peeling paint and a hand-lettered sign. Sheriff's Office, Carroll County. I asked for Deputy Lynn. She was the one who gave talks at our school about safety. She smiled when she saw me, asked if I wanted a sticker. I shook my head and handed her my recorder, my notebook, the insurance printout, the photo with Mom's face cut out. Her smile faded. She read, listened, read again. When she looked at me, she didn't ask if I was sure. She just nodded and said, "Stay here." By dusk, there were 2 officers in our driveway. No sirens, no yelling. Just quiet, measured steps. Dad opened the door like he always did, pleasant, polite, not expecting anything. Then came the cuffs. The look on his face was the first honest thing I'd seen from him in months. Not rage, not guilt, just surprise. As if he truly believed no one would ever stop him. As if he forgot his daughter was watching the whole time. I didn't say a word as they took him away. Didn't wave, didn't cry. I just stood there, hands in my coat pockets, snow up to my knees, and whispered, "You won't feel a thing, we will." They didn't let me go home that night. After they took him away, I sat in the back of Deputy Lynn's cruiser, wrapped in a gray wool blanket that smelled faintly of old cologne and burnt coffee. My boots were soaked through from standing in the snow. My hands, red and stiff, still clenched the recorder I'd used, as if letting go of it might erase everything. No one asked if I was okay, and I was grateful for that, because I wasn't, not even close. At the station, they brought me into a small room with low fluorescent lights and a ticking wall clock that never stopped. A woman from Child Services sat beside me. She had soft eyes and a notepad she didn't use. She offered me crackers. I didn't take any. Instead, I opened my spiral notebook and turned to the page I had bookmarked with a crumpled receipt. One by one, I laid everything out on the table. The calendar I'd drawn with Mom's symptoms, the timeline of what Dad served for dinner, the change in her pills, the salt, the envelope, the storage unit key I'd copied using clay from an art project. She didn't say much, just nodded. Then came the recording. Deputy Lynn entered and sat across from me. She plugged in the recorder, pressed play, and let my dad's voice fill the room. The way he spoke to himself, the way he described her as a burden, as something he wanted gone, as if she were a task he'd forgotten to complete. The adults in the room stiffened. I watched their faces, watched the moment the truth settled on them like cold ash. No one said, "Are you sure?" No one asked if I misunderstood. For once, I didn't feel like a child being humored. I felt like the only person in the room who'd been paying attention for far too long. They asked if I wanted to call my mother. I said yes. They put her on speaker. She sounded tired, dazed. When Deputy Lynn told her, there was a silence so sharp, I thought the line had gone dead. Then came the scream, raw, disbelieving, furious. "You're wrong," she cried. "He would never, never." The call ended before I could say a word. I wanted to say, "I'm sorry it had to be me," but I didn't get the chance. That night, they placed me in a temporary foster home, just for a few days. A quiet couple with no kids. They gave me pajamas that didn't fit and let me sleep with the hall light on. I lay in bed wide awake, staring at the ceiling and counting the cracks. 3 days passed. No word from Mom. Only court dates and statements. Forms with my name printed too big and boxes checked minor witness. On the 4th day, they brought me in for official testimony. The room smelled like printer toner and lemon wipes. A small mic sat between me and the detective. She had gentle eyes, didn't interrupt. I opened my notebook, told her what I saw, what I wrote, what I feared. At one point, she reached for a tissue, not for me, but for herself. And I realized something. They were just now beginning what I had already lived through. And I was the only one who'd survived it all with my eyes wide open. The trial came faster than anyone expected. Once the toxicology reports came in, everything accelerated. They found traces of synthetic compounds in Mom's bloodstream, low doses repeated. A pattern. The kind that doesn't kill you in one night, but weakens, confuses, fogs your memory until nothing feels real anymore. The insurance files didn't help him. Neither did the second policy found in the storage unit, this one with forged initials and a date 3 days before Mom's first collapse. He pled not guilty, walked into court in a gray suit, fresh haircut, and shoes that still had dust on them from the porch he built himself. He never once looked at me. I sat in the front row between two caseworkers and an officer I barely remembered. Mom was beside me, hair thinner, hands shaking. She didn't speak for most of the trial, didn't cry either. She watched every piece of evidence like she was watching a documentary about someone else's life. And maybe she was. When they played the audio recording, I reached for her hand. For a moment, she didn't move, but then her fingers closed around mine. Cold, bone-thin, real. That was the first time she'd touched me in weeks. When I was called to the stand, I walked slowly. Not because I was afraid, but because I wanted every step to be heard. I told them what I saw, what I knew, what I wrote. The notebook sat beside the microphone, its frayed edges suddenly heavier than all the files on the prosecutor's table. Reporters were outside. Photographers, news vans with words like shocking family betrayal in block letters. They called me brave, a hero, the girl who saved her mother. But I didn't feel like any of that. After the verdict, guilty on multiple counts, they led him out in handcuffs. His eyes were calm, his mouth never moved. Even as they read the sentence, even when they said his name, Brent Monroe, husband, father, now inmate. The courtroom emptied slowly, a quiet parade of whispers and shuffling heels. Mom and I sat alone on the bench for a long time. Neither of us spoke. She turned to me, eyes swollen but dry, and said something I will never forget. You saw him, and you still chose me. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing, just leaned my head on her shoulder and let the silence mean everything it needed to. Because justice doesn't always roar, sometimes it breathes. It's been 28 years. I live in a quiet town now in Maine, not far from the ocean, but far enough that the air still smells like pine more than salt. I teach kindergarten, the kind of job where you wipe tears, tie shoes, and learn to read the same stories again and again. Some days I forget the sound of his voice. Other days it returns when I least expected, a turn of phrase, a certain cadence in a stranger's laugh. I've never changed my last name, not because I wanted to keep it, but because changing it felt like pretending he never existed. And I won't do that. I won't erase the past. That's how it survives. After the trial, my mom and I lived with my aunt for a while. Then in a small apartment near the high school, we had less money, less space, but more peace. It took her time to come back to me, to herself. She started over at 50, took up painting, wore more color, laughed less, but meant it when she did. She never remarried, never dated. She said love for her was something that stopped growing the night it almost killed her. She passed away 6 years ago, heart failure, peaceful. I was there, holding her hand. Before she went, she told me, "You saved me twice, once with your words, and once by never letting the truth die with them." That's what this is, the story. Not revenge, not therapy, just the truth spoken out loud. For anyone who's ever whispered it to themselves and wondered if they were the only one who saw it coming. Sometimes people ask me if I ever forgave him. I don't lie. I say no. I say I outlived him. That was enough. He died in prison 12 years into his sentence. Heart attack, alone. I didn't go to the funeral. didn't want to know where they buried him, didn't care what the papers said. They called him a quiet man. A complicated mind, a tragic ending. But the tragedy wasn't how it ended. It was how close he almost got to winning. What I carry now isn't anger, it's clarity. A kind of stillness you earn when you've stood at the edge of something dark and refused to step forward. Sometimes in the classroom, a student will draw a picture of their family. A dad, a mom, a house, a dog. They'll hold it up and smile and ask if it's good. And I always say the same thing. Yes, because it's yours. I never had children, not because I was afraid, but because I learned too young that love isn't always safe and silence isn't always kindness. If you're listening to this and you've ever had a moment where your world cracked quietly, not in chaos, but in a soundless shift, only you noticed, then you know what I mean. Not all monsters scream, some whisper, some wear wedding rings. Some hold your hand while stirring sugar into your tea. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is say it out loud. So now I will. My name is Hailey Monroe. I was 12 when I saw my father try to kill my mother, and I carried that secret for 30 years. Not because I was afraid of him, but because I wasn't sure the world would believe a girl with a notebook and the wrong last name. Now I don't need them to. I believe myself, and that finally is enough. Where are you listening from tonight? Drop your city in the comments, and if this story stayed with you, subscribe. There are more truths waiting to be heard. The house is long gone now, but sometimes when the wind shifts, I still hear the porch creak like someone's coming home. What we survive becomes part of what we carry, but it doesn't have to define where we go next. If this story stayed with you, share your journey below. You're not alone out there.